Well, hey folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Today's video is a supercut. I took a bunch of my DM advice videos, everything from beginner tips, how to run the essentials kit, a variety of videos on how to run the various races and classes, guilds, racial allegories that you could work into your games that might be a bit different from the ones that the people at Wizards of the Coast seem to think is going on in Dungeons & Dragons, and more is to be found right after this brief message. On the off chance that you might be sick and tired of Wizards of the Coast, Dungeons & Dragons, and their rule system, might I recommend
Stewards and Obstacles, the only tabletop role-playing game adventure that allows you to take on the role of stewards of the world's most inclusive role-playing game, to fight hateful content and fully monetize your players.
For use with the Total Party System Rules Handbook. Available now on DriveThruRPG and Amazon.com. Links below. This is going to be a little video, kind of actually for potential new dungeon masters, people who are experienced dungeon masters, might pick something up out of some of the things I have to say. But I'm talking with a new DM, someone who's just started or someone who's thinking about jumping into it. There's a couple of real just basic things that you need to be able to have the beginnings of mastery of. You don't have to be perfect overnight. There's a learning curve. You're not ever going to really get really great at something until you've done it a lot. From my own end, I'm a better adventure designer and setting designer than I am necessarily an in-person game master, because I tend to only run one-shot adventures that last a few sessions, and has been rather large gaps over the course of my adult life in between running those, but I spend a lot of time crafting and working out all the variables and such so that when they are in play, everything runs really super smoothly, people have a good time, they feel like they're invested in what's going on, and everything feels real to them. And if that's the sort of thing that you're trying to accomplish with this, there's a few things you need to keep in mind. In terms of what a game master or dungeon master is, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions. In the end, I would advise, of course I'm going to advise doing what I do, but try to develop, your own voice. Don't listen too much to what other dungeon masters or even the books have to say about what it is to be a dungeon master. This is, even if you're not actually being a novelist or a director in those kinds of terms, there's aspects of being a creative writer that comes along with being a dungeon master, even if you're using pre-published settings and scenarios. And so, it's good to kind of start to develop those sorts of skills, and this is as good of a way as any to kind of give you a reason to start focusing in on that. But as I say, you are not a novelist. If you're trying to write a perfectly crafted plot point by plot point storyline, and you should write a book. There is an element to these games that once they are set in motion, it becomes this big, chaotic, zeitgeist, gestalt kind of thing, this shared imaginary environment that's evolving with everyone's input, and because of the way they stagger everyone's ability to declare what the character's doing in terms of initiative orders and stuff like that. You could have a plan in combat, but by the time it circles all the way back around to you, everything has changed, so you kind of have to throw that plan out and come out with a new plan on the fly of exactly what you want your character to do. It's incredibly dynamic and a real headache at times to keep in your head. But it's unique. It's a unique experience. No other form of entertainment really quite captures that. You have to know your world. There has to be ongoing stuff in the background that is going to be going forward in the setting, typically involving your villains or your major protagonist type of NPC allies that characters can or cannot interact with. But unlike an Elder Scrolls game where you're playing through Skyrim, and you're going through the Dragonborn storyline, but you decide to stop and go do something else for a little while because you can go back and pick up exactly where you left off, and that whole timeline is just kind of just sitting there waiting for you. Well, when you're running a tabletop game, don't do it like that. If you decide to wander off, from fulfilling the legacy of the Dragonborn to destroy Alduin and all that kind of stuff, for a while, then the events of that storyline should be continuing without you while you're off, futzing around and, rifting or whatever. You can't predict the plot points very far ahead of yourself once it's actually in motion. You should put most of your focus and attention on writing your introductory scenario, being very familiar with the starting zone of play in terms of what's all there, how the environment works, how the various sentient and non-sentient life forms that are to be found in the environment, regardless of what kind of genre you're running, like how are they likely to react, what are their motivations, what's their day-to-day gist. It doesn't have to be a perfect photorealistic snapshot of things, but the more you feel that the world that you're creating for your players is real, the more they will feel it's real, because they'll subconsciously pick off of from you that you feel confident and how the Goblin King is going to react to their proposal and all that kind of stuff. You can't take that too far, because you have to juggle a lot of stuff in your head, because once it's in motion, it's going to constantly change on you. Generally, I'm in the camp of, after you have your original starting adventure scenario going, try as best as you can to like plant seeds for further things to have happen at later levels down the line if your campaign can last that long. For the most part, you're just going to be writing for the next session. You finish one session, write a bunch of material for the next session, try to write more material than you need, because after a while you'll compile a bunch of extra stuff that you haven't gotten to use, and then you can kind of refigure that to use in a session every once in a while if you want to take a week off without having to think about these things. It's a money sink and a time sink for yourself, and part of one of the things that is nice about D&D, in spite of its genericness, it's real easy to run because they have everything already statted out for you, and they have all these established settings and tons of adventures, that you can mix and match as you want or just pull things from. I do a lot of videos about Rifts, obviously, and that game is the other end of that spectrum. That takes even more preparation time to be able to run, a Rifts game or any other kind of Palladium game, unless you just entirely learn to fudge it on the fly and just not let on to your players that you don't actually have stats for most of the stuff they're interacting with. Even though it shouldn't matter, players generally don't like finding that kind of stuff out, because then they feel like things are being unfair to them. Speaking of being unfair to your players, you need to really try to develop a impartial judgment to be able to resolve scenarios and questions that arise in the game in terms of how things are going to interact and react to what players are doing with their characters. As long as they feel that you're being fair and you're not giving your NPCs an overt advantage, or you're not favoring one player over the other, they'll be more forgiving and less uptight if something goes against their character's favor because of a decision you have to make on the fly. That's also helpful for being able to design better NPCs that have motivations that seem more real, even though the player characters are not likely to ever actually learn whatever intricate backstory you've come up with for the centuries of history behind this evil lich that's escaping the tomb and terrorizing the countryside, or whatever the scenario you're running is with. The more you feel that it's real and you feel that you understand the NPC and how it's going to, feel about things that happen to it, the more your players will pick up from you the sense of that reality, that that's a fully fleshed three-dimensional being, even though it's completely just a figment of this shared imagination that's going on. The 4 basic functional things you need to do, or need to be able to know, is you need just a touch of acting ability. You don't have to perfectly portray every character and do voices for everything. You don't even have to constantly come up with dialogue on the fly. It's perfectly acceptable to just describe what an NPC is telling the players. It's too commonplace where the entire player character group is trying to talk in character the entire time, which creates some awkward, weird dialogue, because not everyone's necessarily super skilled at coming up with the best prose, on 5-second notice and all that kind of stuff. Your character needs to make a speech to convince the king to do the thing, but you're a 17-year-old kid and you're not necessarily, really going to come up with the best Jean-Luc Picard soliloquy about, whatever the given topic is. Instead, you could make a dice roll and just describe the gist of what your character is saying. You need to remember that your players are both participants. They are playing the game. They're playing along. They are participating. But they are also the audience. To a degree, being a dungeon master is being a showman. I feel it's much more closer to being a carnival barker or a circus ringleader in many ways than it is to being the referee of a football game or a basketball game or anything like that. You need a little bit of acting ability just so you can help portray the NPCs to people. You need just enough creative writing to be able to describe a scenario to people. You need just enough improv ability to be able to resolve that scenario based on what the players have chosen to do with it. Because that's really the whole point of what's going on in these games, is you're describing a scenario. that's got some sort of problem of some sort. That could be combat related, that could be a mystery, it could be a conundrum, it could be some sort of goal they have to achieve through all sorts of manners of ways. In either case, there's some sort of problem that they have to solve, and that you have to be able to describe that scene/scenario well enough that they can feel confident about making any kinds of decisions. You don't give them enough of a description of what's going on, then they're just going to do the one thing that you present to them. If they need to know what the environment is in order to be able to know that there's ways they can get around the goblin without just hacking it to bits and then alienating the Goblin King later on. If you want to be a good game master down the line, I mean, obviously, like no one's going to be able to like instantly pop in with perfect encyclopedic knowledge about like all these sorts of subjects, but there's a lot of social sciences and hard sciences that are really handy to have at least some basic, understanding of, to once again be able to create a world environment that you feel is real and therefore your players will feel is real. The social sciences, to some degree, maybe a bit more than the hard sciences. It kind of depends on what kind of game you're aiming here for, but as regrettable as it is to have to bring up, you might have to know a little bit about political science if you want the kingdoms and nations and star empires of your role-playing game setting to seem at all like they're actually like making decisions out of for the sorts of reasoning, geopolitical or interstellar political kinds of reasoning that actually dictates how politics moves in the real world. You'll want to understand history, not just to kind of be able to better establish a proper sense of continuity as if there has been ongoing forward motion in your setting, but also history is just absolutely chock full of little incidents and stories that your players might not know about at all, and so therefore you can pluck and mix and match and change a few names and all that kind of stuff. To be able to create something that your players are perceiving as some original plot twist, and because you're pulling from something that's not the common pop culture that everyone at your table shares in. Like we already understand plot twists out of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and Harry Potter and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. People will recognize when you're trying to pull a Hydra, in the setting with whatever faction they belong to, and it turns out there's a secret sub-faction within that faction. Ha ha ha. Like they'll know what you're doing if you do that, but they might not understand if you're like pulling a bunch of weird analogies about like the early Republic years of Rome and how they absorbed the surrounding tribes of Italy and all that kind of stuff. Certain personality types have certain kinds of interests and shared interests that all drag us all here. It's a good resource for you as a dungeon master in particular to read up more about history, and also as I say, to help to start to see what those large patterns of reaction and counter-reaction on a global level are like, so that you can replicate that to create a sense of continuity within your setting whenever you're having to reference the background world that all this stuff has emerged from. To the kind of similar degree, sociology and psychology are both handy to know a little bit about, especially since to a degree of psychology in particular with your players, there is a bit of like stage magicianness about all this. You're being a bit of an illusion weaver and knowing how to like create sympathies for characters and NPCs that the players actually can believe in, helps tie them more, invest them more into what's going on, and makes them more likely to keep showing up to continue the game, so that you have more of a better chance of actually having a campaign actually last long enough to even qualify as a campaign and not 75% of an adventure module before everyone parts ways. Geography and cartography, are also like geography is kind of a little bit of both a soft and a hard science. Cartography, you want to familiarize yourself with maps and how maps work. That's kind of the basis to lead into then the geography and geology kind of things that you would also help in your understanding of how the environment that the characters are adventuring in operates. Cartography is like your stepping stone into that. So many role-playing games are dependent upon maps, and so like knowing how maps are designed and the purpose of borders, all that kind of stuff, how borders are typically decided in treaties, and how various kind of land regions kind of dictate the shape of things, and where the choke points are in terms of commerce travel kind of dictates where cities are most likely to pop up. It's good to have an understanding of all these things. As I say, through cartography, you then get into like the actual understanding of like how the geology works, what's been like the ancient cycle of tectonic events that have shaped the land so that you have mountains here and flatlands here. branching off from that into meteorology and oceanography, knowing where your planet's seas are, even if the adventuring environment is like thousands of miles away from those seas, knowing how the oceans are distributed and what kind of air currents there are and where those air currents carry moisture to, over mountain ranges and all that kind of stuff, especially if you're doing a homebrew setting, will help you, have a more realistic in your own head depiction of where your deserts and forests and tropical zones and all that kind of stuff is. The more you can feel that your environment that you're creating is real, the more your players will feel it's real. Knowledge of physics, if you're doing science fiction, or even just, general, being able to describe the mechanics so your players understand why there's limits on range, or throwing things or dropping stuff on people, velocities. The entirety of physics is handy to have a grasp of, even if you don't necessarily need to be doing a bunch of high-end algebra to figure things out. Biology is good, actually having some understanding of medicine and how the human body works, understanding botany, zoology, just a whole slew of sciences are things that you're gonna need to develop some sort of interest in if you really wanna have good, memorable, unique role-playing game sessions. Primary job is you're a showman. You're putting on a show. You are the game being made manifest. You are the most critical component in this entire operation. The people can write role-playing games all they want, and people might buy them and read them and put them on their shelves, and people might want to play them all they want, but without the person who actually puts the game in operation and manages it, the whole thing is just, so much mental masturbation. Don't get too egotistical about how creative you're being. You go in knowing that this is an act of improvisation and that it's going to be hard to predict too far down the line. Plant seeds in terms of the kinds of rumors and background information characters are given, so that they are aware that there might be darker, more dangerous things out there in the setting. Give them several choices and just kind of see what they bounce to on their own once they've resolved whatever the initial situation is. I always recommend trying to give the player characters as focused of a reason to be together and some sort of basic, quick-to-resolve mission, at least at the very beginning of the game when they first start out. Just so you have less wishy-washiness of trying to figure out why these people are together and would even like each other, and why would they talk to the ranger that's sitting at the bar looking at them all mysteriously. If you already start them off where they're employed by that ranger and on the way to go do the thing, and then you can start bringing in the random caveats and come up with whatever your first encounter is. I know some people really like the hard opens, some people like the cold opens, especially once the game is ongoing. How you open any individual given session, it shouldn't always do the exact same thing at the same time, and so far as that this is an ongoing act of entertainment, you should try to work similar themes into the structure of each individual session in this kind of same way that TV shows and movies kind of have a basic kind of rhythms that it goes through in order to be able to let you know about the adventures of Ray Romano and his suburban family. I myself just can't help but observe that everyone loves Raymond, so why not model my games on that? Anyway, yeah, you'll want to read the DM sections in the role-playing games, but don't let that override your own instincts. Try to find your own voice. Take everything you hear from other DMs with a grain of salt. It might work for them, but it doesn't necessarily mean it works for you or that you should have to do it. In fact, for that matter, take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm just some guy. I felt I would talk a bit more about my experience running the D&D Essentials kit, since that ended up being the longest 5th edition campaign I had run, prior to the great change in 2020. I'd picked it up just kind of check it out, and since I knew I had a couple of coworkers who were interested in trying out D&D, the very next day I decided to just go ahead and see if I can get them, interested in playing, and just went ahead and jumped in and ran it without only giving it the most kind of cursory read-through. In many ways, it's kind of janky. There's no real coherent central plot thread. It's basically a bunch of encounter scenes and settings based around a nice little small town in the form of Phandalin, a villainous dragon with no specific direction, and a few kind of things, characters. You can go to a little notice board and just kind of pick a random assignment kind of stuff. I chose one of the later, higher level encounters to be kind of the central hook that they were all going to the town of Phandalin for. I believe it was the Mountain's Toe sub-adventure, where the player characters had been hired to go to Phandalin to meet up with a guy to go investigate why Neverwinter had stopped receiving shipments of gold from the mine. Except they're not supposed to go to the mine until the guy that they're supposed to meet, Don John Raskin, I believe was the NPC's name. They're not supposed to go up there until he gets there to meet them at the hotel, and since he's not there when they first arrive in town, use that as an excuse for them to go kind of pick one of the smaller, first-level initial encounters and run off and go do it and waste a little time and earn some XP. The thing I discovered is that the way a lot of these encounters are designed, they're taking, a collection of, 4 or so, roughly, brand new first level characters and tossing them at challenge rating 3 creatures, which if you got enough characters, including also the fact that the kit was one of the things that started to introduce the concept of sidekick characters into D&D. There's a lot of nail-biting moments of how the hell are these guys supposed to defeat these things, especially since they're inexperienced players in and of themselves, let alone inexperienced characters they were trying to portray. Somehow they managed to survive, though. After the first session or so went along, kind of start to feel out exactly, how to spin plots out of these little encounters that they're going on, and started bringing in some other material to kind of help better explain exactly, what the fuck they're doing there and what's the motivating force behind all this kind of stuff. In addition, of course, to the basic core 3 rule books, 2 basic resources that I found very handy would of course be your Swords Coast Adventurer's Guide, in which case I even found a way to actually reference this group of adventurers that is portrayed on the cover here, but since the Dragon the Icespire Peak takes place in the environments around the city of Neverwinter and also kind of touches on the territories of Yartar, it's a good overview for what the 5th edition version of that area of Forgotten Realms is like. Since these are first time D&D players, and I was trying to give them the classic D&D Forgotten Realms experience, and it's one of the few times I've actually ended up running anything in the Forgotten Realms setting, and so of course it's ironic, despite years of talking shit about it, that I end up having one of my more longer D&D games set in it. Another basic rulebook that was very handy was Volo's Guide to Monsters. Since one of the players was a furbolg, having some other available, races and stuff, so they can break out of the classic elf, dwarf, human, halfling mold. But those are kind of more like just, help, get a grasp of what the background setting that this adventure module takes place in, and to kind of add a little bit more color to some of the creatures they might find. But to kind of create both a justification for why the dragon Cryovane is there and doing what Cryovane is doing, and to present it's kind of a feel that the characters have fallen into some sort of ongoing adventure. I took Horde of the Dragon Queen and basically treating it as if this part of the 2-part Rise of Dragons adventure series had happened and kind of went down in a quasi-failure. The idea is that Cryovane from this module had been raised by the Red Wizards to eventually, once at some point when she was old enough, would be converted over into a Draco Lich. She managed to escape and interfered with the whole adventure to take down the flying castle and the little flying mountain asteroid thing, and causing that to crash, which killed these adventurers who were on that mission, and Cryovane managed to escape somehow with the treasure, and that's why Cryovane is now up at the top of Icespire Peak, and that's why the orcs that were up there have been driven down in the lowlands, and a bunch of other kind of stuff ensues. Eventually, as things went on, I ended up having, since dragons are smart creatures, and Cryovane began to notice that the player characters were kind of interfering in local affairs and all that kind of stuff. Cryovane approached them themselves with the offer of to help her out, because her real goal was to find some sort of way to escape into another dimension, but bring her treasure and stuff with her, which hopefully would have led to kind of like a political deadlock, as various nation states realized that treasure they thought had been stolen by the Cult of the Dragon and Horde of the Dragon Queen, and that they had all thought had been lost when the Flying Castle crashed, was actually there at Icespire Peak, and hopefully that would have led to something where you have the nobles from Yartar and Waterdeep and Baldur's Gate and El Turel and all these places show up on Neverwinter's doorstep, demanding that they get their share of the treasure back, and hijinks might have ensued. But it did successfully, kind of give me some sort of background to hang some of the events and stuff in here on, and to give the players a feeling that they're participating in some sort of big epic thing that's been living and breathing and before they even showed up. Another adventure module I mixed in was Princes of the Apocalypse. Since the Desserin Valley is neighboring to the area described in Dragon of Icespire Peak, I decided to kind of have these events portrayed in this adventure were already kind of going on and kind of waiting for player characters to discover them still. A thing I ended up doing is with the little sub-adventure set in the gnome town of Gnomengard. Instead of it being a mimic that was, causing all the gnomes to go paranoid, it was actually a visiting gnome wizard who had been tricking the people into thinking that was a mimic so that they themselves can get away with doing some nefarious stuff. But one of the things that the player characters ended up finding when they capture this evil gnome wizard is that he was carrying a devastation orb from Princes of the Apocalypse. And so as the adventures started to kind of go forward, there would be times when they'd go back to Phandalin, kind of in between little outings out there into the wilderness to specific adventure locations, where they would end up running into cultists of the Water Cult who were trying to find the Devastation Orb to fulfill events in this. And hopefully that was also going to lead into a hook, so that once they did resolve Cryovane in one way or another, it would give them a natural lead into some mid-tier levels, 6+ type of adventures, had things lasted long enough to get there. Yet I still found it kind of useful, and as I said, the campaign lasted almost a year, roughly. It's not like I was counting at the time, but doing things quasi-weekly, running little 2 or 3 hour long sessions. Still got plenty of entertainment and verisimilitude out of what is otherwise kind of like a figure it out yourself kind of adventure scenario, which is in some ways part of why I like it. It's the fact that it's flawed gives you as a dungeon master much more room to play with it in terms of exactly what the hell it all means, kind of a thing, as opposed to some of the other thicker adventure modules that Wizards of the Coast has produced for 5th edition over the years, which at times overly spell things out, in my opinion. I see some videos, especially lately, I've seen a couple from RPG Pundit talking about, the problem of players not playing in character right, if there is such a thing. And while it certainly is, from a DM's point of view, very annoying when you're trying to create an immersive environment and you are wanting people to play with either the established lore of the setting you're using or to buy into your own lore that you have for your homebrew world. In much the same way that the game companies can't actually tell us as DMs what to do and how to run our games, you can't really tell your players how to play. They're going to do it anyway. The smarter, more experienced, wiser players who have more of a long ball game of wanting to be involved in this hobby will either see or learn over time that maybe they should listen to what their DM wants and not develop antagonistic relations with the person running the game or the other players for that matter. Part of the fun of being in the game is to be playing your part right. So if you want your players to play elves the way you want them to play elves, then they need to have some sort of example of what you want elves to be like. I know that people are out there who like playing halflings. I almost never have actually encountered them in real life, so I know that's a thing. But thanks to pop culture and literature, your average person who gets into role-playing games is familiar with halflings, aka hobbits, aka Kender, whatever you're calling them today. The Lord of the Rings in particular has kind of subtly hammered in a subconscious imprint that halflings are important and need to be protected. since that's, you know, like kind of a good chunk of the theme, or one of the sub themes, I guess you could say, of especially of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is that, you know, the Shire is this good place that all this stuff needs to be stopped before it can get to the Shire, and that's the Shire is like this shining example of just a peaceful, calm life, and that you don't want that innocence snuffed from the world. You know, you can't let it all just be bleak. So, as NPCs, halflings are an ideal damsel race. In my own homebrew setting that I came up with for D&D when 5th edition, when it first came out, which I've run a couple times now, I focused the entire thing around like the last existing Shire. You know, there used to be a big human empire, blah, blah, blah. It ended, and then a bunch of orcs invade from the north, and because of like some prophecy they had gotten from Grumsh, you know, they were, you know, under the impression that like halflings would somehow be the end of their race, and so they go on this big, like, long, bloody crusade, sweeping back and forth across the human empire, you know, wiping out every little enclave of halflings that were living amongst them, until they get almost up to the very last little, like, proper Shire, all little area of land that's part of the empire on the edge of its borders, up on the frontier, that's just halflings. And before they get there, you have like this final alliance where some of the local dwarves, some of the local elves, and some of the local humans get together, and, you know, they defeat the orc army, kill their leader. The last of the orcs are effectively wiped out, aside from a generation of half-orcs that will soon start to appear amongst some of the humans that had special encounters with the orcs as they were pillaging their way across the countryside. So in that fashion, in a weird way, the halflings were the end of the orcs. With all that in the background, you know, set it a couple hundred years later, or 100 years later, or whatever kind of generic bullshit, you have this last Shire, and the player characters are from like the little selection of races that neighbor them, that are aware that this last Shire exists. Around most of the rest of the world, the halflings are just assumed to be extinct. And you kind of frame that all so that that's the kind of the hook of why they care about where they're starting off from, because you have this last little perfect little snow globe of halfling town left in the world, and it's up to you to protect it from the big bad world outside, because, oh my god, they could be snuffed out so easily, and then the halflings are gone. Even if you don't want to play one, you're fond of one, you have good memories of when you were a child and first saw the Lord of the Ring cartoon, or the old Hobbit cartoons from Rake and Bass, or you watched the movies if you're younger and all that kind of stuff as a kid. You know, like that fondness for hobbits is still there in your head, and so it's really easy as a DM to kind of pull on that string and use that to like motivate the characters to give a shit about like why they're doing what they're doing. The other thing though is like you got to do something to kind of make the halflings kind of unique. And so the thing I've always kind of liked doing for a long time, even when running halflings in other settings like in Forgotten Realms, is I kind of portray them as like, you know, on the surface they're friendly, they like other races, they trade with them, they're friends with them, they hang out with them, they go on adventures with them. You know, they'll employ them, they'll be employed with them. Halflings have like lived in humanity's shadow for thousands of years and all that kind of stuff, always with their own little like tiny communities within cities or with little town and hamlets nearby and all that kind of stuff. The thing is subtly though, like their main town and their shire is just built for people their size. Maybe some dwarves might stay there, gnomes can hang out, goblins are small enough that, you know, like they'd be comfortable there, but it's not really designed for any of the medium-sized and larger races. And you know, just because of, you know, farm work and labor and you know, some like local humans and maybe like a little mixture of other things in the area do live and work in the Shire, just working on farms or doing various kinds of odd jobs or specialist kind of stuff, you know. But they're not actually allowed to be in the main town like after 10 o'clock at night or some shit. Like the town actually has a curfew, all big people out, and there's like a kind of a bit of like a ghetto, poor, you know, mud streets, ramshackle shack kind of town, just like a mile or two walk away from the city gates of the main, you know, halfling city, and that's where all the big people live. You just can't maybe help but notice over time that, isn't it weird that they don't want you living around them or around them at night? It's not a skin color or even a species thing. It's entirely just based on like their distrust of things that are twice their height or more, which is not terribly unreasonable. Speaking of racism, elves are, like, it's weird that they don't get as much flack because, if you're going to be going around accusing, like, any of the D&D races of being, like, horribly, like, racist, it's the fucking elves. Like, not only in the way their attitudes are, this lofty ideal of pure androgynous beauty out in the forest with this like, both high magic and high architecture and high art and perfectly in tune with nature. And they're the first race. They're the oldest race. They don't go extinct. They just voluntarily decide to just drift off to some other faraway land so they can be away from everyone. And they live far off in the distance, and all that's okay. I kind of feel like, especially by modern terms, that really should kind of frame elves as kind of being like the subtler villains of the setting in many ways. Like their reasoning about like short term, border conflicts and like, oh, there's a monster over here by this bridge. It's like, yeah, but it's gonna die in 20 years on its own, and I'm gonna live another 400. So like, it changes their motivations, their ability to, how they prioritize stuff is weird, and I feel like a common problem with how like D&D 5th edition in particular portrays them is that they're way too integrated into shit. To most other races, their idea of elves are half elves, because those are probably the elves that you would see the most contact with. Much like with tieflings, I don't really feel like half elves need to have a direct elf parentage. If because tieflings are several generations removed from whatever fucking human being had like mated with a succubus or whatever to create a cambion, and then that cambion kept continuing to breed into human bloodlines, so that generations later you have tieflings. I feel similar with half elves. There's probably like amongst human communities kind of like a small minority of half elves that are kind of mockingly trying to portray themselves as full-blooded elves, even if they don't really know, they don't quite see it the same way. They might live longer than humans, but they're nothing on the scale of the sort of like length of planning and foresight that elves would have to if they're if you're going with some of the more extreme ranges of elf lifespan, depending on your game world. And so like in cities, those would be the elves you'd run into running shops and stuff. I've always found it jarring in D&D when like maybe in the biggest of cities there might be a small enclave of elves, but like to have elves in your random little starting town, there's a elf wizard or an elf clerk at the bank or something like that. It diminishes elves, and it shatters the idea of normality. I know it seems weird to say that you have to establish a sense of normality for your players in a game that's obviously about the fantastic, but the fantastic is not fantastic if you do not establish a sense of what is normal. And so having like your elves are diminished if you're having like every random town has like one or two elves living in it. There should certainly be half elves and human and mixed race communities, but the elves should be like way the fuck out there, so to say, like living deep in the wild, not necessarily like living up in the trees unless they're wood elves, but like having fantastic cities built up in high mountain valleys or in canyons or in like the hearts of massive forests or even deserts, all that kind of shit. I've never been a fan of the drow anyway from the get-go. I never liked them. I've always had a problem with the Underdark as being a thing. I never liked the drow anyway, so I've always tended to go with dark elves and kind of portray them more as like a night elf kind of a thing, as opposed to like elves that live deep underground. Because we already have dwarves, we already have I mean, like, how much redundancy do we need on all this shit? But there's a segmentation to elven society and the way that their sub-races are organized that's also like very kind of racial hierarchical caste system kind of shit. I mean, high elves alone, like obviously they're on the top. Drow / dark elves are kind of like the renegade caste of leadership. It was probably like most in competition with high elves, and so like I guess we knew who won that war back in the day. Then you would have like the tree elf, wood elf type folks, wild elves, whatever you want to call them. At the bottom of the pile, you'll put your stuff like half-elves. Like, it's like they don't need to be called half-elves because they're literally half-elf. It's just calling them 1/10 elves doesn't roll off the tongue quite so well, so they're half-elves. To elf eyes, even though everyone else thinks of half-elves as elves, to elves, half-elves are humans with short lifespans and different temperaments and you know, potentials and likes and interests and all that other kind of stuff. And, you know, whether or not you want to bring in Shadar Kai and Eladrin, you know, you can fit them, you know, into that whole thing too. They still form like a clear like order, in many ways similar to like the giant ordning kind of a thing that was also portrayed in Volo's Monsters, which I also believe got heavily chopped up too. When you pick up a book of D&D and you're looking through Volo's Guide to Monsters and you're reading about giant society, like a light bulb's going to click in your head, and you're going to start demanding everyone around you to start respecting the ordning. Elf player characters are one thing, but just the fact that they don't run into very many other of themselves is communicating something to them, you know, and you should always portray the people they run into as being a little surprised to actually be seeing an elf and not just a half-elf. And yeah, make them kind of just subtly villainous, not snarling, you know, monster in the cave kind of villainous, but, you know, the puppet master pulling the strings of all the political machinations in the land, that kind of shit. Of all, like, the core races in this book, they are, with maybe arguably the Dragonborn giving them a little bit of a lead, they are arguably the most supremacist in mindset. And so it's weird that people want to talk about the poor lowly orc and give them shit and punch them around and demand changes to them, but like, fucking A, man, elves. If you cannot figure out how to portray fighters, wizards, clerics, and rogues in your D&D world as a DM, perhaps you don't really have any business running D&D. These are, you know, the core, most essential basic templates. Almost all the other classes are just in many ways extreme variants of these four. So just in terms of basic advice, I mean, you can do the basic bitch thing that they have in the Elder Scrolls games where, you know, you have like a fighter's guild, a thief's guild, and a mage's guild in the setting. You know, churches for the clerics, you know, think ahead of time what gods, it's not just of what gods are available in the entire world, but like what's like actually directly relevant to the area of whichever game setting you're choosing to use for D&D. Like, you know, what are the actual cults that you're going to find there that clerics will be derived from? Always try to keep in mind that clerics are not priests. Priest NPCs should not be clerics. You know, clerics do have a defender of the faith kind of angle going on with them, since they are capable of wearing, you know, armor and using weapons. They are limited in their weapons, but that's not because of a lot of lack of talent with it or lack of desire to do a little damage in battle. It's that they've taken specific vows not to use, you know, the more harsher, extreme, mutilating type weapons. And beyond that, though, like, yeah, just keep in mind that clerics are supposed to be kind of soft warriors, more defensive in nature, still able to do all the healing kind of stuff. Not quite the same as the shining exemplar knight type stereotype you get with a paladin, perhaps. But, you know, a priest, you would actually kind of get a more accurate portrayal of a priest, I feel, with druids and warlocks, actually, of all things. Fighters, there's more than just one kind of fighter. It's one of the most open-ended templates. You know, everything from a brawler to a gladiator to a knight to, you know, a sailor, like all of that kind of can fit under the umbrella of the fighter concept. And so, like, in terms of that, like, you should help your player when they're developing their fighter character to come up with a more firm internal concept for what kind of fighter they are. And they don't just, because who goes around calling, like, I'm a professional fighter that's not a boxer? Mercenaries don't call themselves that. All, you know, bandits don't call themselves that. Lots of things qualify under the umbrella of fighters, so like a good chunk of your NPCs, especially of a civilized nature, are technically fighters to some way or another. So how much you have to worry about portraying that to your fighter players, probably amongst the least important out of all the classes. Rogues, classically known as the thief, can and is still often used as a thief kind of class. They're also good espionage agents, assassins, spies, detectives. They even make good security officers, city police. Often it takes the exact same skill set to hunt a criminal down as the criminal themselves possess. Is calling them rogue, a little ballless, in the face of like, oh, we don't want to be encouraging children to think they can grow up to be thieves. It's all right for them to think they can grow up to be clerics and fighters and wizards, but we don't want them to grow up thinking that they could be a thief. Just in terms of the naming, that if you want to have like a detective or a law enforcement type of rogue, having their class say thief on the character sheet, it does kind of, I feel like it skews it automatically to having to be engaged in criminal activities, let's say. And so that leaves us with wizard. Wizards are incredibly customizable. How often your players encounter wizards and other magic users really dials up the level of what kind of fantasy world they exist in. It's one thing for one of the players to be a unique and special wizard, but if they're running into them all the time, they're not really a unique and special wizard anymore. Or are you looking for that kind of fantasy world where you're kind of replacing modern technology with magic? If you're aiming for that low fantasy, gritty, magic's there, but you rarely encounter it, well then, make sure there's not a magic shop in every town, and that there probably isn't any wizards guilds. You might occasionally see like a wizard running a kingdom as some like despotic tyrant in some tower out there in the wilderness, this one lone wizard that everyone leaves alone, and the players might be their apprentice being sent out on their first mission, or they stole their master's spell book, or all of those kind of like classic tropes that we all love to put into our player characters and NPCs. Is your player character's wizard never going to run into another wizard? Or is he going to run into them all the time and work for them and go on missions for them and kind of feel outshadowed? Because, why are they even asking me to do this stuff when they can do it better, easier, and faster because they got more magic and all that, yada, yada, yada. So those things to consider. I would run with the idea that the elves are actually behind this all. The elves want the humans and the orcs to be at each other's throats and hate each other and constantly arguing and pointing fingers out of whether it's the humans or the orcs that are the most evil and do the most damage to the world and oppress people the most and all that kind of stuff. This keeps everyone distracted from the fact that there's a massive gap in wealth and education and magic between the elves and most of the other quote-unquote lesser races, as they like to put it. And, a lot of this is also, helped in many ways so that they can get away with this, thanks to the efforts of a bunch of sellout half-elves. How much are halflings actually, low-key responsible for, poor human peasant farmers not being able to get ahead in life, when they're stuck living in the Shire and all that kind of stuff? Sometimes we have to punch down to punch up. If you're looking for a race in D&D that should represent pre-colonial peoples, equatorial, quote-unquote, primitive savages who live in the swamps and use primitive technology and are easily sucked up by surrounding civilizations and forced into hard labor, well, you're looking for lizard folk. And for some reason, though, they don't seem to get the attention, which is possibly in and of itself a sign of subtle racism. So anyway, there you go. Feel free to use these talking points in your games or in your online conversations. Try to say these things with as straight as face and straight a vocal tone as you can. You don't want people to catch on that this is all a massive act of sarcasm. This video is turning out to be a little bit longer than I expected. We're already up to what? I've only used 20% of the material I have from these old videos I did on how to DM various races or how to DM various classes and other little addendums that go along with them. So I guess this is going to be a bit of a series, so stay tuned. More will be coming pretty soon, actually. It's just, don't want to spend 12 hours waiting for one video to upload because it's 6 hours long. So until next time.
Stay waspinated.